We've arrived at part 3 of our Elements of Handicapping for Preakness 149, and it is speed. And that's certainly a very, very vital component in our handicapping. And what we do is we have a number of different speed figures that people use, and so we're trying to incorporate all of them as best we can. We're going to use the Beyer speed figures from Daily Racing Form, Brisnet, speed figures, then Equibase. We didn't use that for the Derby, but one of my colleagues has been using it to pretty good effect, so I thought we'd give that a go as well, because that number is not just a final time, it does also incorporate some other factors, and those are the numbers that we like. And then finally, we're going to use Thorograph. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, the lower the Thorograph number, the better, including negative numbers, which are outstanding. Thorograph incorporates all aspects of racing: ground loss, post position, weather, wind, track conditions. So it's a very comprehensive speed number, and it tends to be pretty accurate. And what it does is exposes patterns that all horses have in terms of how they're going to run. So it's a very important number. So what we did was we averaged out the speed figures for all the contenders of the Preakness from their last race. So for the Beyer speed figure came out at an average of 91.44, the Brisnet 95.55, Equibase 101.33, and Thorograph 5.18. Now, we also have our progression, our subjective number, that from the first two parts you're familiar with, where we go plus or minus 2 in that range, depending on whether we think the horse will move forward, will run about the same as he has been, or perhaps regress. And that's a way to sort of level things off a little bit, and where potentially, if in the last race the horse ran a number that's maybe a little lower than we think he's going to run, so we want to give him some credit for that. And also we want to take away if a horse is going to bounce. So that's the idea behind using the progression tab. First one we'll look at is Mugatu, and we'll see that he ran an 87 Beyer in the Bluegrass. And incidentally, we're going to be using the last race with a couple of exceptions that I'll get to. He ran an 87 in the Bluegrass and got a 93 Brisnet figure, a 96 Equibase, and a 7 Thorograph. So he's minus 4.44 below the average Beyer speed figure, minus 2.55 below the Brisnet figure, minus 5.33 below the Equibase average. And you'll note with the Thorograph, he got a 7, which is higher than the average, but because Thorograph goes by lower numbers, the better, that's obvious. A higher number here is not good. So he gets a minus 1.82. So we add those all together and we get a subtotal of minus 14.14. Now, I'm going to add in a point because I do think Mugatu's in a forward-moving pattern, and I think he's ready to run a better race. The question is, will it be good enough to be competitive here? I'm not so certain of that, but we do want to give a little bit of credit for a horse who is improving. So he gets +1, and he comes up with a minus 13.14. So now we'll come to Uncle Heavy. And in order to be fair here, and mainly this has to do with Just Steel as well. We all know Just Steel did not run a representative race in the Kentucky Derby of how good he can be. So instead of using the Derby for Just Steel, we're going to use the Arkansas Derby. And so for Uncle Heavy, to be fair, I thought the Wood Memorial was pretty subpar, and it doesn't stack up very well. And I'm pretty sure Uncle Heavy can do better than that. So I'm going to use the Withers. And I hope that's clear. The attempt is to try to get a fair representation of what this horse is capable of doing. And then we can compensate for that with our progression, with our plus or minus 2. So for the Withers, Two starts back. Granted, the Wood Memorial is the more recent one, but again, we're explaining why we're using it. He got an 84 Bayer, which is 7.44 below average. Brisnet, 94, that's 1.55 below average. Equibase, 95, 6.33 below average. And then a Thorograph, he's a little bit above average in the withers. So for those of you who are fans of his, he is capable of running an above average race. Whether he's going to have the race shape to do that in the Preakness remains to be seen. I have a feeling it probably won't be. But you add them all together, and he ends up with a minus 14.64. But again, we're going to add a point back for progression because I do think this horse will run a good race, knowing Butch Reed and the way that he ships. And I think this horse can rebound from what was a kind of a subpar Wood. But again, the race shape, not going to have a lot of pace to run to. I think that does impact Uncle Heavy's chances. So that is incorrect. Obviously, that minus 38.64. So it is minus 13.64. And I apologize for that. I did this very early this morning, so sorry. But it's minus 13.64. You'll see that in the overall tab. So when we come to Catching Freedom, was coming off what I thought was a very good Kentucky Derby. And you see for that, he got a 97 Bayer, a 95 Brisnet, a 107 Equibase, and a 3.25 Thorograph. So he's above average on all counts, plus 5.56 above the Bayer speed average, plus 0.55 above the Brisnet, plus 5.67 above the Equibase, and plus 1.93 above the Thorograph, which gives him a total of plus 13.71. Now, Catching Freedom, I think, will maintain the kind of form that he's been in. Whether he's going to build off of the Kentucky Derby and run past that, I'm not so sure, but I think he's going to run a good race. My concern with Catching Freedom is I think he's going to have to be even more forwardly placed than he was in the Derby because of the lack of pace and the general race shape. And that may take something away from his closing kick, which makes him so effective. However, I think this is a good horse and one who is improving, and it's entirely possible that he runs a big race and is certainly a win candidate. So he gets a +1. I won't go as far to say a +2 just because I think he's more in a maintaining stage than building for a big one. So Muth has obviously scratched, which impacts things quite a bit. We've lost a lot of early speed from this race. And I would think that would tend to help Mystic Dan a bit. We'll take a look here, and we see he got 100 Bayer for the Kentucky Derby. And frankly, I think any horse who wins the Kentucky Derby is going to get a 100 Bayer. They're just not going to get any number below that. I think maybe one year they gave a 99. It might have been for Rich Strike. I'm not sure. But most of the time, it's a minimum 100. I know Giacomo got a minimum 100. People were a little suspect of that. So I'm not taking anything away from the race that Mystic Dan run, but just a little bit of an explanation there. So that's above average quite a bit. The Brisnet number of plus 145. Equibase is significantly above average. And he got a 3 on the Thorograph, which is significantly higher than the average. So you get a plus 19.86, which is a very good score in this field speed-wise. For those of you who are fans of Mystic Dan, I have never denied that this horse has speed. There's other things about him that I don't like. I'm giving him a -1, and you may wonder why I would do that, but I sort of explained it in form and class. It's more about how Kenny McPeek points his horses to races. And so I just have a feeling that he won't be quite as sharp as he was in the Kentucky Derby. Now, it would maybe be a -2 for me, except for the fact we're pretty sure we're going to have mud, and we know Mystic Dan can run fine in the mud. And again, as I've mentioned, I think that Southwest Stakes was more about the rail bias that occurs when it's wet as opposed to it just being generally muddy. We've seen the way this horse runs. He hugs the rail all the way around the track. And for him, someone with his pedigree, that makes a lot of sense, is to save as much ground as possible. Certainly should be able to do it in the Preakness. The question I have is just whether or not he can fire a big number back to back. That's the question for me more than anything else. However, I think this does note, given the, especially with Muth out of the race, that you have to bump up Mystic Dan in terms of where you had him previously. And I think he's a horse you can use in this race now. I was kind of prepared to toss him. I'm still not sure he's a win candidate, but speed-wise, he certainly ranks amongst the top, especially with Muth scratched out. So now we come to Seize the Gray, and we look, and this now we remember, as always, the Pat Day Mile is a one-turn race, and now Seize the Gray is returning to 2 turns. And we see you got an 88 Beyer, which is below average, a 92 Brisnet, which is below average. The Equibase number is below average. The Thorograph was above average. So the Thorograph, again, this is why we like this number, because it can tell you that he ran a little better than perhaps the other numbers would indicate. So that number would put him in a pretty good place, whereas the other ones would put him below average and fairly below average. So we want to think about that. And I would probably rely more on the Thorograph number here than necessarily the other 3 in this particular instance, because when you have 3 negatives and then all of a sudden a positive, we want to give I think we want to have as favorable an analysis of every horse as we can, and that way we can stack them up well against each other. So he gets a minus 14.64. As my way to compromise a little bit, noting that the Thorograph was positive, I'm adding back a point. The main thing is I'd like to add 2, but with the coach, you just don't know. And I think this horse can run a good race. I think it's entirely possible. I'm just not sure at 2 turns that necessarily that this is a race where he can be very competitive. And I'm just not sure that class-wise he's amongst the better horses in this race. But he's certainly coming in pretty good form. I just don't know if he's going to go into that Wayne Lucas zigzag pattern that we often have. So I'd love to give him 2 points, but I can only give him 1. So he ends up with a minus 13.64. So now we come to the other coach entrant, Just Steel. And now, as I mentioned with Uncle Heavy, we're using the Withers. With Just Steel, we're going to use the Arkansas Derby. And I think it bears explanation because the Kentucky Derby, obviously, he's a better horse than that. I think he was just a little too sharp. I thought Keith Asherson probably made a mistake putting him up on the lead that early and that far up. And he certainly paid the price for a horse who's run quite a bit this year. And I think the Derby, maybe it caught up with him to a degree. So can he rebound from that and run a good race here? It's entirely possible. He's done it before. I thought he was dead after the Rebel Stakes, and look what he did in the Arkansas Derby. This, to me, using this race is more representative of a best-case scenario for Just Steel. I'm not so certain that he will run back to these numbers, and consequently, I've given him a -1 progression-wise to sort of account for that a little bit. But if he does, he would have to be considered a major player in this race. Really what it comes down to is looking at all the other aspects of handicapping here, and we can't rely just on speed. We have to think about form, and we have to think about the race shape and everything else. So this is only one aspect, and I grant you that perhaps the answer to what Just Steel kind of race he's going to run probably lies somewhere in between the Arkansas Derby and the Kentucky Derby. Let's put it that way. But best case scenario, if you're a fan of Just Steel and think he's going to run big, this is probably the kind of race you can expect speed-wise. But again, this is the idea, trying to have favorable perceptions of all the horses and do it, give them, not use clunkers that they probably won't run back to. I don't see Just Steel, much like we did in the Oaks with Fiona's Magic running that awful race. I just didn't think it was fair to use that as a reference point. So that's kind of why we're doing this. And I hope we're good with it. I hope we understand the reasoning behind it. I just thought it required a little extra explanation. So don't mean to harp on it. So now we come to Tuscan Gold. And I like this horse a lot, the Chad Brown trainee, especially now with Muth out of the race. We look at that Louisiana Derby, only his third start. He gets a 95 Beyer, which is above average. A Brisnet 98, above average. The Equibase, interestingly enough, was below average. And again, it has to do with how they calculate their numbers. And so that's very interesting. It's very similar to Seize the Gray. But we do look over at his Thorograph, and we see it's above average. And again, Thorograph to me, when we talk about speed, I think that's the more comprehensive number. So I think this horse is going to run a big one. He's trained by Chad Brown. Chad Brown loves throwing horses into the Preakness, loves skipping the Derby, and then bring him in and running big. And obviously Tuscan Gold didn't have the points for the Derby, but I think I'm pretty certain that Tuscan Gold, it looks to have a lot of upside from his pattern. So he's getting a +2. And he ends up with a plus 3.36, which is, is okay. It's probably about middle of the pack, or a little bit below for this race. But I think he's certainly capable of better, and that's why we have our plus and minus for progression, because this horse is on a pattern where I think he's going to run big. So now finally we come to Imagination, and we look at the Santa Anita Derby, 89 Beyer. You look at how Stronghold did in the Derby. Stronghold, I thought, ran a good race, but he just wasn't fast enough. And if you want to compare Imagination to him in terms of those figures, then, Imagination maybe not so hot here, except for a couple of things. You see the Brisnet, the Equibase, were both above average. Now, the Thorograph, he has run a 5.5 for 3 straight races. And for the Thorograph pattern, when you see horses consistently hitting the same number over and over again, there's a very good potential they can run a big one at some point. Now, I hearken back to National Treasure, another Bob Baffert, kind of the same pattern as last year, and look what he did in the Preakness. So he may look a little slower than the better horses in this race, but I think it's very logical that this horse is going to take a step forward. Whether or not it's enough to win the Preakness, I don't know, but Bob Baffert has said he's just now figuring this horse out. This was a slow learner. He has run to his competition. Never something I like to hear about any horse. I want to see him running better than their competition. And I think mentally he still may be a little immature, but he looks like he's getting it. And the point is he does compete. And so from a speed perspective, I think it's logical to expect this one is certainly capable of running a better race. And I think will. In my opinion, I think it's Bob Baffert in the Preakness. He wouldn't be there unless he thought he was going to move forward. So you take all that together, he gets a plus 2.02. We're going to add plus 2 for progression because I do think he's going to run a big race. Whether or not it's good enough to win the Preakness, not sure about that. So he ends up with a plus 4.02. So if we look at our field, here we see our winners highlighted in green. You see Mystic Dan and Just Steel tied for the lead. I would tend to put Just Steel Mystic Dan rather, a little bit ahead for the recency of the Kentucky Derby. And again, we've explained why we've done this. But Just Steel, certainly capable of running a winning Preakness, I think. Now, the Catching Freedom is in third. And then we have our negative scores, which are highlighted in red, and you see Mugatu, Uncle Heavy, and Seize the Gray. Again, Seize the Gray, maybe we don't. It wasn't as bad as that, let's say. Still, I'd like to see a better effort on dirt around 2 turns, but I think he is capable of better than that. And that's why we look at all four aspects, because speed is just one part of it. So from a speed perspective, Mystic Dan probably going to be the favorite in the race. Looks pretty good from that perspective, but other variables keep me being a little skittish about him. Tuscan Gold, I frankly thought would score better. And we're still in the embryonic stages of our process, so maybe we have to do some tweaking. I'm not sure some of these speed numbers are necessarily representative, but there they are. And I hope it does help and give us some perspective towards the Preakness, especially without Muth. And I think it becomes a much more wide open race without Muth. And really, we're just going to have to see who can get to the lead. And I think that race is going to be run from the front end. So we'll just have to see. But we've got Pace coming up later, and then we will put it all together probably on Friday. So be on the lookout for that. I'll talk to you soon. Till then, be well.